I am Goat Boy.
He will put the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on his left. Jesus, in Matthew 25:33. This is not a Bible studies video, but rather a video on how goats and sheep have impacted human history and civilization in ways that are similar on a functional level, but very different from each other on a cultural level. On one hand, both of these creatures, goats and sheep, are domesticated animals that eat similar plant-based foods. Both chew their chuds, and both of them are used for a variety of similar products, be it wool, leather, milk, meat, cheese, etc. However, they have different behavioral patterns. Sheep are easy to care for, they flock without question, and can be easily kept in a pen. They're very passive. Now, on the other hand, you have goats, which tend to wander off, be more independent, and are more likely to show some stubbornness and aggression. While not the first domesticated animals, that honor would go to the dog, sheep and goats were one of the earliest during the agricultural revolution in what is now modern-day Iraq. People would domesticate species of wild sheep called the mouflon. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. These wild sheep look more like goats, as they have not endured countless generations of artificial selection to produce lots of wool. Today, the mouflon is an obscure creature relegated to the Caucasus Mountains. But the same is not true for their domesticated counterparts, which number in over 1 billion. Over the course of this domestication, sheep were bred to produce more fat, protein, milk, and wool, while at the same time being less aggressive, with smaller and less menacing horns. On the other hand, you have the goat, which were domesticated from, well, wild goats, shocking, right? Around Anatolia, the ancient parts of Turkey, along with the Caucasus Mountain range and the plains further south in the Middle East. Humans would domesticate these wild goats. These goats, while grazing on grasses on flat plains, would oftentimes prefer browsing bushes and leaves in areas that were more rocky and had larger shrubs. Humans eventually would domesticate these wild goats, and they would also breed them to be less aggressive, and their horns also got less intimidating. They produced more meat and milk as well. Their ears oftentimes became floppy like those of dogs, and these are oftentimes associated with more docile traits. Today, the wild version we probably domesticated them from is an obscure bizarre ibex related to the hilly forests of Iran and Armenia. I have no idea whether I'm pronouncing the species name correctly either, as there isn't too much information about them. In both wild species, a variety of breeds popped up from their domesticated counterparts as human populations diverged and kept these animals for different purposes. While similar, they obviously are not the same species, so when they did breed together, their offspring ended up becoming sterile, like mules ended up when, say, you breed donkeys and horses. In alpine climates, where insulation was more important due to the colder conditions, sheep and to a lesser extent goats were shaved for their wool. Humans specifically bred them to have more highly fibrous proteins on their fur. Keep in mind that in sharp contrast to many other animals, both sheep and goats could migrate easily, which worked perfectly for nomads. The sheep tend to eat grass and the goats tend to eat shrubs, so they could be able to be kept together without much competition. These nomads roamed the lands like hunter-gatherers but still practiced agriculture on the grasslands and hills, in sharp contrast to the people who settled from one spot to harvest crops. This contrast between farmers and shepherds was one of conflict and cooperation, as shepherds who tended the goats and sheep tended to roam away from the densely populated river valley, and their lifestyles and cultures were oftentimes vastly different from those who farmed rice, wheat, and corn in permanent settlements. Conflict between nomadic shepherds and settled farmers is illustrated in the Bible story of Cain and Abel, in which Cain, a farmer, kills his brother Abel, who was a shepherd. However, I would argue that throughout much of human history, it was oftentimes the other way around, as nomadic peoples tended to, let's just say, be fond of raiding and pillaging settlements before the advent of gunpowder. The Middle East, with its usually flat terrain for the most part, and relative occasional hills without much foliage, would be great for shepherds, as sheep and goats would convert the grassland cellulose, which humans can't digest, into meat and milk. Shepherd cultures developed what some would call an honor-based culture. Given the fact that these nomads lived in areas without formal states or rule of law to any significant degree, they oftentimes had a more aggressive attitude towards outsiders. In a world where your livelihood was dependent on your moving livestock, the presence of any nearby entity, be it wolf or human, could mean the end of everything to you. As a result, the notion of shoot first, ask questions later became the norm. Honor-based cultures emerged wherever there was pastoralism, as you had a sort of macho valor, basically separating life from death, or at the very least, from your belongings. Partially as a result of this, these cultures based off of nomadic sheep and goat herding tended to be more belligerent, whether it was from the steppes of Mongolia or the highlands of Scotland. The various peoples who tended to sheep and goats would incorporate them into their religious tales and folklore. In ancient Greece, this was seen in the tale of the golden fleece for sheep, or the perverted satyrs, who were part human and part goat and oftentimes represented excess sexuality. This tends to fall in line with what we've seen from other cultures, in which sheep tend to be viewed more positively and goats oftentimes more negatively. This is most obviously seen in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Jewish traditions sometimes involve sacrificial lamb offerings. On Yom Kippur, the Festival of Atonement, goats were oftentimes chosen to be sacrificed. On the other hand, one goat was chosen who would eventually escape into the wilderness and would carry the sins of the community. This is where the concept of the scapegoat comes from. The Christian tradition oftentimes refers to the followers of Christ as his flock, the Lord being thy shepherd. The sacrificial lamb was taken to a new level, with Jesus oftentimes being compared to one. To this day, much of the Christian world views lamb meat as the dominant dish served at Easter celebrations, partially for this reason, celebrating the resurrection of Christ. Goats, on the other hand, due to their disobedience, were oftentimes seen as symbols of, you guessed it, Satan. This eventually led Christians to associate pagan religions with goat imagery, even though these pagans weren't necessarily satanic. The depiction of the devil in Christianity with his horns and hooves is heavily influenced by the Greek satyrs. Yeah, the stereotypical Western depiction of a devil or demon is basically a red goat person who's really horny. Modern materialist Satanism oftentimes uses the symbol of the goat in their rituals and customs despite not believing in a literal Satan. They also feature prominently in modern occult and conspiracy theories. Today, the animal has lost much of its spiritual significance. With zoos and documentaries, there are far more interesting animals than sheep and goats. However, they still play a fairly prominent role in the economy. Sheep wool is still the dominant type of wool outside of the Andes region of South America, and dairy products from sheep and goats tend to be secondary compared to cows. Goat and sheep cheese tends to be liked by people who prefer acidic flavors, as opposed to those produced by cows. Lamb is also quite a popular meat in the Middle East, as there's a high history of pastoralism. It's also common in India, as Hinduism prevents the consumption of beef. In the West, lamb is oftentimes eaten on special occasions like the aforementioned Easter holiday. Lamb basically refers to the baby sheep, or at the very least a sheep that has less than 1 year under its belt. Mutton, on the other hand, refers to adult sheep meat, which is far tougher in texture and oftentimes is used for stews rather than, say, lamb chops. Mutton is extremely difficult to find in North America. Much of the sheep meat we find on international markets is usually in the form of lamb, and it comes from Australia and New Zealand. The golden fields below the southern Alps of New Zealand's South Island make for ideal grazing lands for the sheep, even though sheep aren't native to New Zealand, and neither are goats for that matter. Goats are less popular in the developed world. Goat herding is usually associated with poor nomadic peoples from the developing world. Nonetheless, it is still quite popular in certain portions of the West, as you have more Caribbean immigrants, particularly from Jamaica, bringing goat-based dishes into the mainstream. In parts of rural sub-Saharan Africa and the Indian subcontinent, goats provide nutrition and a livelihood for millions. And while goat herding is oftentimes associated with rural backwardness for better or for worse, these creatures have also been at the forefront of science and technology. In 1996, the world was stunned when Dolly the sheep was born as the first cloned mammal. This came about by replacing the embryonic stem cell with somatic cells that were neither stem cells nor sexual gametes, to grossly oversimplify the science. This famous sheep had 3 different mothers. One mother provided the DNA, another provided the egg, and another one got pregnant. Unfortunately, Dolly died in 2003 due to arthritis along with a lung ailment, neither of which were directly related to cloning. Goats caught up on the scientific craze with Nuri, which came about in India due to a similar process as Dolly. Nuri unfortunately passed away in 2023, survived by her 3 biological mothers as well. And that, my friends, is a grossly oversimplified history of how goats and sheep have impacted human history. Thanks for watching.